1763, the year Britain redefined America. The war had finally ended, but for most people in the American colonies, it did not feel like an ending at all. For nearly a decade, the conflict that Europeans called the 7 Years' War, and colonists knew as the French and Indian War, had shaped everyday life. Men had left farms and workshops to join provincial militias. Supplies had been requisitioned. Trade routes had been disrupted. Frontier settlements had lived with constant fear of attack. Even those far from the fighting had felt its pressure through taxes, shortages, and uncertainty. Now, in 1763, official word arrived that the war was over. France had been defeated. Its power in North America had collapsed. Canada was no longer French. The Mississippi Valley had changed hands. On paper, Britain stood unrivaled on the continent east of the river and nearly so beyond it. In London, this was celebrated as a triumph of strategy, endurance, and imperial destiny. Church bells rang, proclamations were read aloud, maps were redrawn with confidence. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was far more restrained. Colonists did not erupt into celebration because the war had never felt distant to them. It had been fought on their land, near their towns, along the edges of their farms. Victory did not feel abstract or glorious. It felt exhausting. Families welcomed home men who returned older, poorer, and changed. Some did not return at all. Veterans came back expecting that their service would matter, that land, opportunity, or at least relief would follow. Merchants who had supplied the war looked for repayment and renewed trade. Farmers hoped that peace would finally allow them to plan more than one season at a time. Most of all, colonists believed that the purpose of the war had now been fulfilled. For years, British officials had justified the conflict as necessary for colonial security. French forts and alliances with native nations, they argued, threatened the safety of British settlers. Removing that threat would stabilize the frontier, open land for settlement, and reduce the need for military intervention. Colonists accepted that logic. Many supported the war precisely because they believed it would secure their future. So when peace arrived, expectations arrived with it. Victory, in the colonial imagination, meant freedom of movement. It meant westward expansion without fear of French-backed resistance. It meant fewer troops, lower costs, and a return to local control. The empire had asked much of them. Now it was time for the burden to lift. But in Britain, the meaning of victory was calculated differently. British officials looked at the end of the war and saw an empire stretched thin. The cost of fighting on multiple continents had been staggering. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled, and interest payments alone consumed a large portion of government revenue. Maintaining the empire in peacetime now appeared more expensive than fighting for it had been. The war had also created a new problem: responsibility. Britain now controlled vast territories it had never directly administered. French Canada, the Ohio Valley, and lands stretching toward the Mississippi were no longer buffers or contested zones. They were British holdings, and with ownership came obligation. These regions were not empty. Native nations still lived there, traded there, and defended their autonomy there. The absence of French power did not mean the absence of resistance. From London's perspective, peace did not reduce risk. It revealed it. Officials feared that unregulated colonial expansion would provoke widespread frontier conflict. Conflicts Britain would be expected to suppress and finance. Every settler who moved west carried the possibility of violence behind them. Every clash risked becoming another expensive war. In that context, victory demanded control. This was not how colonists understood the moment. To them, the end of the war closed a chapter. To Britain, it opened a new one focused less on conquest and more on management. That difference in interpretation mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Colonial society in 1763 was not radical. It was not revolutionary. It was deeply invested in British identity and British protection. Colonists called themselves British. They celebrated British victories. They taught their children British history and law. They believed their rights flowed from their status as subjects of the crown. And yet, that loyalty rested on assumptions. They assumed that Britain governed lightly because distance made strict control impractical. They assumed that colonial assemblies would continue to manage local affairs. They assumed that wartime restrictions would ease in peacetime. They assumed that sacrifice would be met with trust. None of these assumptions had been formally promised. They were habits, built over decades of relative autonomy and benign neglect. The war disrupted those habits. During the conflict, Britain had intervened more directly in colonial affairs. Troops had been stationed in colonial towns. Military officers had overridden local authorities. Supplies had been seized. Movement had been restricted. These measures were tolerated because they were framed as temporary necessities. Peace was supposed to undo them. Instead, Britain hesitated. British leaders now questioned whether returning to old patterns was wise. The war had revealed weaknesses in colonial defense, inefficiencies in local governance, and the dangers of leaving imperial policy to chance. From London's view, the colonies had grown too important and too expensive to be left alone. Colonists did not hear this reasoning clearly in 1763. Communication across the Atlantic was slow, and policy shifts emerged gradually. What they noticed instead was absence, the absence of relief, the absence of reassurance, the absence of a clear signal that normal life would resume. The war that had justified so much disruption was over. Yet the disruption lingered. Troops did not immediately withdraw. Restrictions did not immediately lift. Imperial attention did not fade back into the distance. Instead, it hovered. This uncertainty created unease, not anger. People debated what the end of the war meant. Some argued that Britain was simply slow to adjust. Others believed that peace required patience. Most assumed that any remaining controls would soon disappear, just as they always had before. Very few believed that the war had permanently altered the relationship between Britain and its colonies. And that belief, that this was merely a pause before returning to familiar arrangements, shaped how colonists interpreted everything that followed. 1763 did not begin with resistance. It began with expectation. Expectation that peace would restore balance. Expectation that victory would be rewarded. Expectation that the empire they had fought for would now loosen its grip. The tragedy of the year was not that these expectations were unreasonable. It was that Britain no longer shared them. With the fighting finished, British leaders turned to a question they had long postponed. What kind of empire had the war created, and how should it now be governed? For much of the previous century, Britain's American colonies had existed in a space defined by distance and distraction. The Atlantic Ocean slowed communication. Wars in Europe consumed attention. Colonial affairs were important, but rarely urgent. Laws regulating trade and governance existed, yet enforcement was uneven. Smuggling was common and often overlooked. Colonial assemblies managed taxation, courts, and local policy with broad latitude. This arrangement was not accidental, but it was not carefully designed either. It evolved from convenience. Britain lacked the administrative capacity to oversee every corner of its empire directly, and the colonies largely governed themselves in ways that kept trade flowing and loyalty intact. The war exposed the limits of that system. British officials reviewing the conflict saw repeated failures they attributed to colonial autonomy. Militias had resisted discipline. Assemblies had delayed funding. Supplies had arrived late or not at all. Coordination between colonies had been inconsistent. From London's perspective, these problems were not just wartime inconveniences. They were structural weaknesses. Victory did not erase those concerns. It sharpened them. Britain now possessed more territory than ever before, but also more responsibility. Governing a sprawling empire required predictability. Predictability required rules, and rules, in the minds of British policymakers, required enforcement. This did not feel radical in London. Britain itself was governed through hierarchy, law, and centralized authority. Parliament regulated trade. Taxes funded defense. Armies enforced order. Extending similar logic to the colonies seemed not only reasonable, but overdue. The colonies, after all, benefited enormously from membership in the empire. They traded under British protection. They enjoyed access to global markets. They relied on British military power. In the eyes of British officials, expecting greater compliance in return was not oppression, it was balance. This shift in thinking marked a subtle but profound change. Before the war, Britain had tolerated inefficiency in the colonies because the cost of fixing it seemed higher than the benefit. After the war, inefficiency itself became the cost. Debt, defense, and territorial management demanded attention. The colonies were no longer peripheral, they were central. As a result, imperial policy began to change tone. Instead of viewing colonial assemblies as partners, British leaders increasingly saw them as obstacles. Instead of assuming loyalty would smooth over disagreements, they worried that local interests might undermine imperial stability. Instead of trusting distance to limit conflict, they sought clarity and control. To British policymakers, this was modernization. To colonists, it felt like intrusion. Most colonists did not object to the idea of empire. They objected to the idea that the empire was changing without their consent. They had grown accustomed to making decisions locally. They had built political cultures around assemblies, town meetings, and negotiated authority. They believed that being British included the right to manage their own internal affairs. What unsettled them in 1763 was not a single policy, but a pattern. Decisions increasingly came from London rather than from colonial capitals. Orders were issued without consultation. Assumptions about colonial obedience replaced dialogue. The empire that had once seemed distant now felt attentive, and that attention carried weight. Yet it is important to understand how colonists interpreted this shift at the time. They did not see it as a betrayal. They saw it as confusion. Many believed British officials simply misunderstood colonial realities. Distance, they assumed, had distorted judgment. Once Parliament and the Crown better understood conditions in America, policies would adjust. Petitions, letters, and respectful protests were viewed as sufficient remedies. The idea that Britain might fundamentally redefine the relationship did not yet take hold. Colonists still believed in the empire's fairness. They trusted that British law protected their rights. They assumed that imperial authority operated within limits, even if those limits were occasionally tested. From Britain's perspective, however, patience was wearing thin. Officials questioned why colonies that benefited so deeply from imperial protection contributed so little to its cost. They questioned why laws were obeyed selectively. They questioned whether loyalty could be relied upon if local interests conflicted with imperial needs. These questions did not yet produce confrontation. They produced planning. Committees reviewed colonial administration. Military leaders argued for permanent troop presence. Treasury officials searched for ways to stabilize finances. Maps were studied not as symbols of victory, but as logistical challenges. The empire was no longer thinking about winning territory, it was thinking about holding it. And that distinction mattered, because an empire built for conquest can afford flexibility. An empire built for maintenance demands order. As 1763 progressed, colonists sensed that something had shifted, even if they could not yet name it. Authority felt firmer. Oversight felt closer. The informal arrangements they had relied on for generations began to feel uncertain. The empire had not yet imposed itself fully, but it was preparing to. One of Britain's greatest concerns in 1763 lay beyond the settled edges of the American colonies, in the vast interior that had just changed hands on European maps, but not in lived reality. The war's end removed France as an imperial rival, but it did not remove the peoples who lived between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. Native nations across the region had fought, negotiated, and adapted throughout the conflict in ways that preserved their autonomy. Some had allied with France. Others had played European powers against each other. Many had defended their lands independently, viewing the war not as a European contest, but as another chapter in a long struggle to control their homelands. From Britain's perspective, this posed a serious problem. The empire now claimed responsibility for territories it did not fully understand and could not easily control. British officials knew that rapid colonial settlement would almost certainly provoke violence. Settlers would push into native lands. Retaliation would follow. Frontier militias would demand protection. And Britain would be drawn into another costly conflict. One fought far from its centers of power, with unclear objectives and no guaranteed end. In London, this was not an abstract fear. Reports of unrest arrived regularly. Forts were attacked. Traders were killed. Supply lines were threatened. The costs of maintaining order in the interior were already rising, even before large-scale settlement resumed. Security, therefore, became the guiding principle of imperial policy. This approach contrasted sharply with colonial expectations. For many colonists, the frontier represented possibility. Land was abundant west of the mountains. Population pressure along the coast had grown steadily. Farms were divided among heirs until plots became too small to sustain families. Young men, in particular, looked west as a way to establish independence. Veterans believed they had earned access to land through service. The war had reinforced these hopes. Many colonists had enlisted specifically because they believed victory would secure Western expansion. Military service and land ownership were closely linked in their minds. The end of the war was supposed to unlock opportunity. Instead, Britain paused it. British leaders did not see this as a denial of colonial rights. They saw it as a temporary measure to prevent chaos. Settlement could proceed later, they believed, once treaties were negotiated and boundaries stabilized. Order first, expansion second. Colonists heard something different. They heard delay. They heard restriction. They heard authority asserting itself over ambition. Yet even here, resistance did not erupt. Many settlers simply ignored imperial concerns and continued moving west quietly. Others waited, assuming restrictions would be lifted. Still others argued that frontier violence was exaggerated or manageable, pointing out that local militias had long handled such conflicts. What they did not grasp was how dramatically Britain's tolerance for risk had changed. Before the war, frontier conflict was largely a colonial problem. After the war, it was an imperial liability. Every skirmish threatened Britain's credibility as a global power. Every escalation risked drawing resources away from Europe, where rivals still watched closely. Security, therefore, became a justification for control. British officials believed that by limiting settlement, they could reduce violence, stabilize relations with native nations, and avoid further debt. They did not see this as oppression, but as responsibility. Colonists, however, experienced the policy emotionally, not strategically. To them, security had always been something they managed themselves through local defense, negotiation, and adaptation. Imperial intervention felt unnecessary and distant. It suggested that Britain no longer trusted colonial judgment. That implication mattered. Trust had been the unspoken foundation of colonial autonomy. Britain trusted colonists to manage their internal affairs. Colonists trusted Britain to protect their rights as subjects. The war strained that balance. The post-war emphasis on security strained it further. Still, in 1763, this tension remained subdued. Colonists debated, they complained, they wrote letters and petitions, they argued in taverns and assemblies, but they did not yet frame their concerns as a challenge to imperial authority. They believed the issue was timing, not principle. Britain, however, was already thinking in terms of permanence. Security was not a temporary concern. It was now central to how the empire understood its American territories. The frontier was no longer just a place of opportunity. It was a potential source of instability that had to be managed from afar. As the year progressed, the gap between imperial caution and colonial ambition widened quietly. No lines had yet been drawn on the map, but the priorities that would draw them were already firmly in place. In October of 1763, Britain transformed caution into policy. The Proclamation of 1763 was issued not as a dramatic announcement, but as an administrative decision, a statement of order intended to stabilize a fragile situation. It drew an official boundary along the Appalachian Mountains and declared that lands west of that line were temporarily closed to colonial settlement. Any movement beyond it required explicit approval from the Crown. On paper, the proclamation was framed as a measure to reduce violence and manage relations with native nations. British officials argued that unregulated expansion threatened peace, endangered settlers, and risked provoking another costly war. By slowing settlement, they believed they could negotiate treaties, define boundaries, and establish a more durable system of control. From London's perspective, the logic was sound. From the colonies, the effect was jarring. For years, westward movement had been not only tolerated but encouraged in practice. Land speculation was common. Colonial governments issued grants. Veterans expected compensation in acreage. Families had already crossed into disputed regions, building cabins and clearing fields under the assumption that victory had secured their claims. The proclamation did not simply pause future plans. It called existing assumptions into question. Colonists struggled to understand how a distant government could suddenly declare limits on land they believed they had earned. The boundary was drawn thousands of miles away by officials who had never seen the frontier. It cut through territories that colonists already inhabited or intended to claim. Yet the immediate response was not rebellion. It was disbelief. Many colonists assumed the proclamation would be ignored, unenforced, or quickly revised. British laws had often existed more as guidance than constraint. Smuggling, illegal settlement, and quiet defiance were long-standing features of colonial life. Few believed this decree would be different. Some continued moving west anyway. Others waited. Colonial officials hesitated, unsure how strictly to enforce a policy that contradicted local interests. The proclamation's authority existed on paper, but its reality was uncertain. Still, something fundamental had changed. For the first time, imperial authority directly opposed colonial ambition in a clear and unmistakable way. The conflict was not over trade or taxation, issues that could be debated abstractly. It was over land, the most tangible form of opportunity and independence in colonial America. Land meant stability. Land meant inheritance. Land meant escape from crowded towns and rigid social structures. By restricting access to it, Britain inserted itself into the most personal decisions colonists made about their futures. British officials did not see this as an intrusion into private life. They viewed land as a strategic resource. Settlement patterns affected defense, diplomacy, and imperial credibility. Uncontrolled expansion threatened all three. Colonists, however, experienced the policy emotionally. The proclamation suggested that victory in the war had not delivered what had been promised, or at least what had been expected. The sacrifices of the previous years suddenly felt less meaningful. Service had not unlocked opportunity. Loyalty had not guaranteed trust. Yet even now, colonists framed their objections carefully. They argued that the proclamation misunderstood conditions on the ground. They insisted that settlement could proceed peacefully. They believed that once officials realized how impractical the boundary was, it would be adjusted. Their language remained respectful. Their identity as British subjects remained intact. What unsettled them most was not the boundary itself, but the implication behind it. The proclamation suggested that Britain now believed it had the authority to decide where colonists could live, independent of colonial governments and local needs. It implied a shift in who controlled the future of the continent. That implication lingered, even as enforcement remained uneven. As 1763 moved toward its end, the proclamation line stood less as a physical barrier than as a psychological one. It marked a point at which imperial priorities were made visible, and colonial expectations were quietly frustrated. No confrontation followed immediately, but the space between obedience and resentment had narrowed, and the year continued under the shadow of a line that few had expected to see. Despite the pressures that had begun to surface across the colonies, most people did not experience 1763 as the beginning of a rupture. They experienced it as continuity. Colonists still understood themselves as British subjects. They lived under British law, relied on British institutions, and believed that the empire they belonged to was ultimately just. The war had been costly, but victory reinforced that belief rather than weakened it. Britain had protected them, expanded its power, and secured the continent from a rival empire. loyalty still felt earned and rational. That loyalty shaped how colonists interpreted the changes unfolding around them. Restrictions on settlement were not immediately understood as permanent. Military presence was not yet seen as occupation. Increased oversight of trade was framed as a temporary response to extraordinary circumstances. Most colonists assumed that peace required patience and that imperial authority would ease once stability returned. When frustration arose, it took careful form. Petitions were written with respect. Colonial assemblies debated policy using the language of precedent and shared tradition. Complaints emphasized misunderstanding rather than injustice. Colonists did not yet challenge Britain's right to govern. They questioned whether its officials fully understood colonial conditions. This restraint did not come from passivity. It came from confidence. For generations, colonial life had been shaped by a balance between imperial authority and local autonomy. Britain governed, but from a distance. Local leaders managed daily affairs. Custom filled the gaps between law and practice. That arrangement had survived wars, crises, and expansion. Colonists believed it would survive this moment as well. Trust allowed them to absorb pressure without immediate resistance. They believed the system still worked. They believed their voices still mattered. They believed loyalty would still be rewarded with consideration. Changes were interpreted as adjustments within a shared framework, not as a redefinition of the relationship itself. Yet beneath that confidence, assumptions were beginning to shift. Authority felt closer than before. Oversight felt more deliberate. Decisions felt less negotiable. These changes were subtle enough to be dismissed individually, but together they suggested that the empire was becoming more structured, more attentive, and less willing to rely on informal arrangements. Most colonists adapted to these shifts rather than confronting them. Adaptation bought time. It allowed daily life to continue. It allowed loyalty to remain intact. It allowed people to wait and see whether the empire would return to familiar patterns or continue along this new path. Nothing had broken, but something quieter had occurred. Colonists had begun paying closer attention. They listened more carefully to imperial decisions. They noticed patterns where they once saw exceptions. They compared the present to the past in ways they had not needed to before. Loyalty still held, but it now carried questions with it. And those questions did not disappear. As the year moved forward, one reality became increasingly difficult for colonists to ignore. The British Army was not leaving. During the war, the sight of red coats in America had been understood as temporary. Soldiers arrived for campaigns, built or occupied forts, marched along roads, and then moved again. When the fighting shifted, the troops shifted with it. Even when they wintered in a town, people told themselves it was for the season, for the war, for the emergency. Military authority expanded when danger demanded it, and then, as every colonist assumed, it would recede. That assumption had deep roots. British political tradition distrusted standing armies in peacetime. A permanent army living among civilians was the classic warning sign of a government that intended to rule by force rather than consent. In Britain itself, the army existed, but it was a constant subject of debate and scrutiny. Parliament argued over its funding and size. Citizens watched it with suspicion. The belief that liberty required limits on military power was not a fringe idea. It was part of the political memory of the nation. Colonists carried that language with them across the Atlantic. They read the same pamphlets. They inherited the same political fears. They had grown up believing that the difference between a free people and a controlled people could often be measured by how easily soldiers could be placed in their streets. And yet, the war had softened those fears, not erased them, but pushed them aside. When French power still hovered in Canada and in the interior, the presence of British troops felt like protection. When frontier settlements were threatened, the army felt like a shield. When rumors spread of raids and alliances, the red coat became a reminder that the empire could project strength. So, in early 1763, many colonists expected the army to shrink quickly. Peace, they assumed, would mean demobilization. It would mean fewer forts, fewer patrols, fewer requisitions. It would mean a return to civilian authority, to local decision-making, and to a government that felt once again distant enough to be flexible. Instead, the opposite happened. British officials concluded that the war had not eliminated the need for troops in North America. It had increased it. The empire now possessed more territory and more obligations. New borders had to be held. Newly acquired regions had to be secured. Forts that had once been outposts in contested zones now became anchors of imperial control in lands that were, on paper, British, but in reality, still governed by the peoples who lived there. Frontier violence did not end with the peace treaty. In many places, it intensified. Native nations who had never consented to British expansion did not accept that French defeat meant British authority. Traders and settlers continued to move into contested spaces. Forts became targets. Supply lines were attacked. British commanders sent urgent reports to London describing a continent that was not settling into peace, but bracing for further conflict. From London's perspective, a standing army in America was not a luxury. It was insurance against a second disaster. The war had been costly beyond imagination. Britain could not afford to lose the territory it had just won. It could not afford to allow the interior to descend into chaos. And it could not afford to retreat into the casual neglect that had made coordination so difficult during the war itself. This logic sounded reasonable in Parliament. In the colonies, it felt different. It felt personal. A standing army is not experienced as a spreadsheet entry or a strategic diagram. It is experienced as presence, as uniforms at the edge of town, as new rules at the port, as officers who do not answer to local assemblies, as soldiers who require supplies, quarters, roads, and deference. Even when they do nothing aggressive, their very existence changes the balance of power because it reminds everyone who ultimately has force behind them. In some colonies, troops remained concentrated near frontier forts. In others, they were stationed closer to settled towns. Either way, the effect was the same. The empire was no longer distant. It was physically near. For colonists, this raised immediate questions. Who was paying for the army? British officials argued that the empire was protecting America and that America should share the cost. Colonists replied that they had already shared the cost, through taxes raised by their assemblies, through men sent to fight, through supplies provided during the war. They did not deny that defense mattered. They questioned why defense now required permanent military presence and why that presence should be funded through mechanisms that bypassed local consent. Who controlled the soldiers? In theory, British military authority was separate from civilian law. In practice, the line blurred wherever troops lived among civilians. Officers enforced discipline. They negotiated or demanded supplies. They expected cooperation from local officials, and when conflicts emerged, the chain of command ran not to the town council, but to British commanders and, ultimately, to London. Who decided where troops were placed? Colonists understood that wartime deployments followed battle needs. Peacetime deployments followed political needs. If soldiers were stationed in a town, it was not because a French army was approaching. It was because the empire believed a town needed watching, controlling, or symbolically anchoring. That distinction mattered. It turned protection into oversight. And perhaps, most importantly, how long would this last? If the army stayed this year, would it stay next year? If forts were reinforced now, would they become permanent fixtures of the landscape? If troop presence became normal, would colonists ever again live without the constant reminder of imperial force? In 1763, many colonists tried to answer these questions with optimism. They told themselves the army would shrink once frontier tensions calmed. They assumed Parliament would reconsider the expense. They believed Britain would recognize that peace required trust, not constant monitoring. But the year itself kept undermining that hope. As the months passed, the army did not contract. Garrisons remained staffed. Supply contracts continued. Forts were repaired rather than abandoned. Military planning shifted from short-term campaigns to long-term positioning. In other words, the empire acted as if troops were not a temporary response to a crisis, but a permanent tool of governance. This was a new experience for many colonists. They had lived under the crown and parliament, but they had rarely lived under soldiers. The difference was not simply physical, it was psychological. When authority is distant, people negotiate with it. They interpret it. They adapt it to local reality. When authority stands in the street, negotiation feels riskier. Interpretation feels less flexible. Adaptation feels more like defiance. They also began to notice how the army changed relationships inside their own communities. A town that hosted soldiers had to deal with new forms of negotiation: contracts for food, firewood, and transport, arguments over prices, disputes about property damage, questions about discipline when soldiers drank in taverns or wandered beyond their posts. Even when incidents were minor, they were handled differently than ordinary conflicts between neighbors. A soldier answered to an officer answered upward. In peacetime, that imbalance was harder to justify. During war, colonists could accept inconvenience as survival. In peace, inconvenience looked like policy. And the army's presence did not stay confined to the frontier. Ports felt it too. When customs enforcement tightened, soldiers sometimes supported officials, escorting seized goods, backing inspectors, standing as silent reinforcement behind the paperwork. A merchant might argue with a customs man and still expect the argument to remain a matter of law and influence. Add a uniformed soldier to the scene and the argument feels different. The same words carry new consequences. The same refusal feels closer to risk. This is why, even without violence, the mere visibility of troops mattered so much. It changed what colonists believed was possible. Colonial leaders tried to keep the conversation calm. Governors reassured assemblies. Assemblies reassured citizens. They emphasized that Britain was acting from caution, not hostility. They reminded people that loyalty had carried the colonies through the war and that loyalty would carry them through the peace. But reassurance competed with memory. Many colonists remembered that the war itself had brought moments of humiliation. British officers had sometimes treated colonial militias with contempt. Provincial troops had been ordered, dismissed, disciplined, and mistrusted. Colonial assemblies had been pressured for supplies. Local authority had been overridden. Those experiences were not forgotten in 1763. They simply lacked a political outlet. The war had made them tolerable. Peace made them harder to excuse. At the same time, Britain's reasoning did not seem completely alien. Colonists knew the frontier was unstable. They knew that raids and reprisals continued. They knew that forts could not simply be abandoned overnight. Many colonists, especially those near the frontier, wanted protection. They feared being left alone more than they feared being watched. That split mattered because it prevented a single colonial reaction. Coastal merchants, interior farmers, and frontier settlers experienced the army differently. Some saw a burden. Some saw a shield. Some saw both at once. What united them was the creeping recognition that Britain was redefining the normal relationship between civilian life and imperial power. In a world where the army stays after peace, the government is no longer only a set of laws. It is a presence that can be placed wherever the empire believes it is needed. That principle, once established, is difficult to reverse. In 1763, colonists did not yet use the language that later generations would use. They did not yet speak of occupation. They did not yet accuse Britain of plotting tyranny. They did not yet organize resistance around military questions. But they began to watch. They began to notice how quickly protection could slide into control, not because soldiers were cruel, but because soldiers were obedient. They existed to carry out decisions made elsewhere. They did not need to hate colonists to enforce rules colonists disliked. The system did not require malice to feel oppressive. It only required permanence. And permanence was exactly what the year seemed to be normalizing. It also changed how colonists imagined their own governments. Assemblies could vote money, but could they refuse support if London insisted? Local courts could enforce civil law, but what happened when military needs collided with civilian procedure? Town officials could set rules for markets and taverns, but could they regulate the conduct of men who answered to military codes? These were not theoretical questions. They emerged in everyday disputes about supplies, lodging, and authority. In 1763, most of these disputes were handled quietly. Agreements were reached, payments were made, problems were patched over. The machinery of empire continued to function. But functioning is not the same as trusted. Trust depends on the belief that power has limits. The army's continuing presence suggested that the limits were moving. And because the year ended without a clear explanation from Britain, without a promise of withdrawal, without a timeline, without a reassurance that peacetime would restore the old balance, colonists carried the question into the next year like a weight they could not set down. They did not yet know what Parliament would do. They only knew that the empire was now close enough to be felt. So when people spoke of 1763 as a year of peace, they meant something narrower than Britain meant. Peace meant the end of French threat. It meant fewer funerals, fewer alarms, fewer years of emergency. But peace did not mean a return to the old distance. The empire had won, and now it intended to hold what it had won. Holding required soldiers. Soldiers required obedience. Obedience required presence. By the end of the year, colonists could look around and see that presence in their forts, in their ports, and sometimes in their streets. It was not yet a cage. It was not yet an open fist. It was simply a reminder, steady, quiet, undeniable, that Britain's power was no longer only writ.
As British authority became more visible in 1763, a quieter question began to surface in colonial life. Who exactly was now making decisions? For generations, most colonists had experienced government as something nearby. They voted in town meetings, watched local courts, and argued with neighbours over taxes, roads, fences, and parish support. Colonial assemblies made up of local elites, but still local, raised revenue, set policies, and negotiated with governors. Even when the Crown appointed officials, those officials lived among the people they governed. The system felt imperfect, but familiar. Power was close enough to be argued with. The war interrupted that comfort. During emergencies, military commanders overrode civilian preferences. Governors pressed assemblies for money and supplies. New rules appeared quickly. Yet colonists tolerated these intrusions because they were framed as temporary. War required speed. War required coordination. When the war ended, colonists assumed the machinery of local governance would return to its old rhythm. But peace did not restore the old rhythm. Instead, 1763 introduced hesitation and ambiguity. Orders increasingly came from London. Not suggestions, not broad guidance, but instructions. Governors acted under tighter constraints, wary of approving measures that might conflict with imperial priorities. Matters once treated as local, settlement policy, trade enforcement, frontier defence, were reframed as imperial concerns. The result was not a single moment of confrontation, but a slow feeling of displacement, as if the centre of gravity in colonial politics was shifting out to sea. Colonists could still meet in assemblies. They could still debate local bills. They could still petition. But they began to wonder whether their decisions were becoming provisional, valid only until someone in London disagreed. This uncertainty showed up in small ways. A proposed tax might be delayed because a governor hesitated to sign it. A local trade rule might be questioned because it touched imperial regulation. A land grant might be challenged because it crossed a newly asserted boundary. People who had once assumed their governments had room to improvise now found themselves waiting for approval or fearing disallowance. Waiting changes politics. When decisions are delayed, suspicion grows. When approval becomes uncertain, autonomy begins to feel conditional. Part of what made the question so unsettling was that colonial political life had been built on layered legitimacy. Colonies had charters, some had proprietors, some had royal governors. But within those structures, assemblies had become the practical engines of government. They managed budgets. They decided how to raise money. They negotiated with governors over militia funding and public works. They regulated the everyday rules that shaped commerce and community. This arrangement created a lived expectation that government would be accountable to local communities, even if ultimate sovereignty belonged to the Crown. Colonists did not need to articulate a theory of sovereignty to feel its presence. They felt it when they paid taxes, when they watched court decisions, when they petitioned, and when they voted. The system worked because it balanced imperial identity with local control. In wartime, the balance tipped toward imperial need. That was tolerable because it was framed as temporary, and because colonists could still see the threat. They might resent British officers or complain about supplies, but they understood why the empire was pressing. In peace, however, the reasons became less visible. When authority remained tightened after the threat had receded, colonists began to suspect that the tightening was not about necessity, but about design. This suspicion was sharpened by how the war had changed Britain's view of the colonies. British officials had watched assemblies bargain, delay, and sometimes refuse. They had watched militias resist discipline. They had watched colonies cooperate only when it benefited them. From London's perspective, the war was a lesson. Loyalty could not be assumed to produce compliance. Compliance had to be structured. Structure, in practice, meant that governors would be less free to compromise. It meant that local exceptions would be treated as risks. It meant that policies would be made with empire-wide logic rather than colony-specific detail. It meant that the centre, London, would claim a stronger hand. Colonists could feel this shift in the language of officials. A governor who once said, "Let us see what the Assembly will grant," began to say, "My instructions do not allow it." An imperial official who once winked at informal practice began to speak of violations and obedience. These small phrases mattered because they signalled that negotiation was narrowing, and negotiation was the lifeblood of colonial politics. Colonial societies were diverse and unequal, but their political cultures were intensely participatory compared with Britain. Towns debated local spending, newspapers spread arguments widely, churches and taverns served as informal forums where politics were discussed in ordinary language. People might not vote in every colony, and power rested with elites, but public opinion mattered. Assemblies feared backlash, governors feared unrest. The system functioned through continual bargaining. When decisions appeared to move away from local bargaining, colonists feared not only new policies, but a new political reality. A world where their assemblies could talk, but could not decide. This fear was still in its earliest stage in 1763. Many colonists still trusted the British constitutional tradition would restrain imperial overreach. They believed that the same principles that protected liberty in Britain, limits on arbitrary power, respect for property, the importance of consent, would apply to them as British subjects. They assumed that if a policy seemed unreasonable, it could be challenged through lawful petition and precedent. But lawful challenge requires a forum that listens. As London asserted more direct control, colonists wondered where that listening would occur. Parliament had no colonial representatives. The Crown appointed governors. Imperial bureaucrats answered upward, not outward. If colonial assemblies lost authority, where did colonial voice go? That question remained mostly unspoken, but it hovered beneath discussions of land, troops, and trade. It was the question behind the question. It also revealed a deeper mismatch. Britain increasingly treated the colonies as territories, while colonists increasingly treated themselves as political communities with expectations of self-rule. Neither side announced this mismatch directly in 1763, but it shaped reactions and resentments. This is why even ordinary disputes carried new weight. A disagreement over a port fee or a militia levy could now be interpreted as a test of imperial patience. A local compromise could be overturned by a distant instruction. A governor's decision could be shaped more by fear of London's disapproval than by the colony's needs. In that environment, colonists began to read motives into procedures. They also began to watch one another. If authority was shifting upward, then influence might shift as well. Merchants looked for allies in other colonies. Assembly leaders corresponded more frequently. Printers compared stories from different ports and capitals. These connections were still loose in 1763, but they reflected an instinct that would grow stronger later. If local voice mattered less, then colonial voice might have to become broader. In the moment, most colonists did not call this opposition. They called it defending our rights, or protecting our charter, or simply making our case. They believed they were participating in the normal processes of British political life: petition, debate, precedent. But the content of their arguments was beginning to change. Instead of focusing only on specific complaints, colonists increasingly emphasized structure: the role of assemblies, the tradition of local consent, the expectation that internal affairs belonged to the colony. This structural language was not yet, if imperial authority was felt anywhere most immediately in 1763, it was in the colonial economy. For generations, economic life in the colonies had existed in a space shaped as much by habit as by law. Trade regulations existed, but enforcement was uneven. Smuggling was common and widely understood as part of doing business in a world where geography, distance, and necessity shaped behaviour more than statutes written in London. Governors, customs officials, and merchants often worked within informal understandings that kept goods moving and communities prosperous. This system was not seen as disloyal, it was seen as functional. British trade laws had always been written with imperial priorities in mind, but colonial economies depended on flexibility. Crops failed, ships arrived late, markets shifted, rigid enforcement could ruin merchants and destabilize towns. So enforcement bent. Everyone knew it bent. The empire tolerated this because trade still flowed, loyalty still held, and the cost of strict control seemed greater than the benefit. The war temporarily altered this balance. Military necessity demanded tighter coordination. Supplies had to be tracked. Shipping had to be protected. Revenue mattered more. Wartime enforcement expanded, but colonists accepted it because the threat was visible and the justification clear. War required sacrifice. Peace was supposed to relax that pressure. Instead, 1763 brought continuity and then escalation. British officials emerged from the war deeply aware of the Empire's financial vulnerability. Debt weighed heavily on Parliament. Interest payments consumed revenue. Officials began examining every part of the imperial system for stability and predictability. Colonial trade, once tolerated as loosely regulated, suddenly appeared as a missed opportunity for reliable income. From London's perspective, this was not an accusation of colonial dishonesty. It was an accounting problem. Smuggling undermined tariffs. Informal trade arrangements reduced customs revenue. Enforcement gaps translated into lost funds. If the empire was to support its expanded responsibilities, colonial trade had to become more orderly, more predictable, and more accountable. Oversight increased accordingly. Customs officials received stronger instructions. Ports were monitored more closely. Inspections became routine rather than occasional. Paperwork multiplied. Merchants who had long relied on relationships and discretion now faced procedures that could not be negotiated away. This shift was felt first by merchants, but it did not remain confined to them. Merchants were central figures in colonial life. They financed shipping, extended credit, employed labourers, and supplied goods to towns and farms. When trade slowed or uncertainty increased, the effects rippled outward. Prices fluctuated, credit tightened, delays disrupted supply chains. Merchants did not initially describe these changes as political oppression. They described them as disruption. They argued that rigid enforcement harmed colonial prosperity and, by extension, imperial prosperity. Trade, they insisted, flourished when allowed to adapt to local conditions. Over-regulation threatened growth, employment, and stability. Their complaints were framed in the language of shared interest, not resistance. British officials heard those arguments and largely dismissed them. From London's perspective, the problem was not regulation itself, but colonial expectation. Merchants, officials believed, had grown accustomed to informality and now mistook it for entitlement. The war had shown how fragile imperial systems could be when left to local discretion. Correction was necessary. This reflected a broader shift in imperial thinking. Economic life was no longer viewed primarily as opportunity. It was viewed as infrastructure. Infrastructure had to be managed, standardized, and enforced. Informality, once tolerated, became a liability. Colonists sensed this change even before new taxes were introduced. The language surrounding trade shifted. Officials spoke less about partnership and more about compliance. Merchants noticed that enforcement felt less negotiable. Decisions came from above, backed by authority rather than persuasion. Ports became places not just of commerce, but of observation. Ships arrived under scrutiny. Cargoes were inspected carefully. Violations carried consequences that felt more certain. Even when enforcement was technically lawful, its tone had changed. Trade still flowed, but it no longer felt autonomous. It felt watched. This mattered because economic independence had always underpinned colonial confidence. The ability to trade flexibly gave colonists resilience. It allowed them to adapt to shortages, shifts in demand, and regional differences. When that flexibility narrowed, colonists began to worry not only about profit, but about control. Who decided how trade would operate? Who determined what was acceptable risk? Who benefited from enforcement, and who paid its cost? These questions were not yet framed as accusations. They were framed as concerns. But they added another layer to the growing sense that Britain was redefining how the empire functioned. and that colonial voices were becoming less central in that definition. By the end of 1763, colonists had not yet faced new taxes, but they had experienced something that prepared them to notice when those taxes arrived: the feeling that economic life itself had become a site of imperial management rather than mutual benefit. That awareness lingered, quietly shaping expectations for the year to come. By late 1763, colonists increasingly sensed that the empire they belonged to no longer felt like the one they remembered. Nothing dramatic had happened. No law had declared a new order. No proclamation announced a fundamental shift in colonial status. Yet comparison crept into everyday thought. Colonists compared how authority felt now to how it had felt before the war. Before, Britain had seemed distant. Oversight was irregular. Enforcement was flexible. Local decision-making filled the gaps left by imperial absence. Autonomy was not declared, but it was lived. After the war, that absence receded. Authority felt closer. Oversight felt intentional. Explanation felt thinner. Decisions were increasingly justified by efficiency, cost, and stability rather than tradition or shared identity. This contrast mattered because colonial identity had been shaped not just by British law, but by British neglect. The space created by distance allowed local cultures, economies, and political practices to develop with confidence. Over time, that confidence became expectation. Colonists believed they understood how the empire worked. 1763 challenged that understanding. The empire they experienced now seemed less tolerant of improvisation. It seemed less willing to rely on trust. It appeared increasingly focused on management rather than accommodation. British officials did not see this as a betrayal of colonial rights. They saw it as modernization. The empire had grown too large, too costly, and too complex to be governed casually. Order required structure. Colonists did not reject structure in principle. They questioned its direction. They asked whether an empire organized around efficiency could still accommodate local independence. They wondered whether distance would ever again soften authority. They debated whether loyalty alone could preserve autonomy. These debates remained cautious. Colonists still called themselves British. They still trusted British law. They still believed that imperial unity mattered. No one spoke openly of separation. The idea of independence was not a serious topic in 1763. But certainty had weakened. Colonists no longer assumed that shared identity guaranteed shared priorities. They began to suspect that Britain's view of the colonies was changing, from partners in empire to components of a system. This suspicion altered how new policies were interpreted. A decision that might once have been dismissed as temporary now felt permanent. Oversight that might once have been tolerated now felt intentional. Each action was increasingly read as part of a pattern rather than an exception. This shift was psychological before it was political. Colonists became more attentive. They read imperial news more carefully. They discussed policy more seriously. They began to see connections between military presence, economic oversight, and administrative control. The empire had not become hostile. It had become structured, and structure, unlike neglect, requires justification. In 1763, Britain had not yet provided that justification in terms colonists found convincing. Policies were issued, instructions were enforced, but the underlying vision of empire, the reason this new structure was necessary, remained largely unexplained to those who lived under it. That gap in understanding mattered. When people do not understand why authority changes, they begin to imagine motives. When explanations are absent, interpretation fills the space. Colonists debated whether Britain feared them, distrusted them, or simply misunderstood them. None of these interpretations produced immediate resistance, but all of them weakened the assumption that the empire and the colonies were moving toward the same future. By the end of 1763, colonists had not rejected Britain. They had begun to reassess what belonging meant. Belonging now seemed conditional, and conditional belonging invites scrutiny. The empire felt different because it asked more questions, imposed more limits, and trusted less. That difference would shape every response to imperial policy in the years ahead. Even before conflict emerged, the relationship itself had changed. As 1763 came to an end, the American colonies did not stand on the edge of rebellion. There were no riots, no coordinated resistance, no declarations of defiance. Most colonists continued their lives as they always had. Fields were worked, ships sailed, courts convened, churches filled. On the surface, the colonial world appeared stable. Yet stability no longer meant certainty. The year had not produced crisis, but it had produced doubt. Colonists ended 1763 with fewer assumptions than they had begun it with. They were no longer sure that peace would restore familiar arrangements. They were no longer confident that imperial authority would remain distant and negotiable. What unsettled them most was not what had happened, but what had not ended. The war was over, yet troops remained. Peace had arrived, yet oversight increased. Victory had been secured, yet autonomy narrowed. These contradictions were difficult to reconcile. Colonists debated their meaning quietly. Some argued that Britain simply needed time to adjust to its expanded responsibilities. Others believed that the changes reflected a deeper, permanent shift. Most hovered between patience and unease. The absence of clarity itself became a source of tension. For decades, the empire had functioned through habit. Colonists knew how far authority extended because it rarely pressed. When disputes arose, compromise followed. Distance softened enforcement. 1763 disrupted that rhythm. Authority pressed just enough to be felt, but not enough to be resisted. Oversight increased without open confrontation. Decisions were centralized without explanation. The empire moved closer, but not aggressively. This made response difficult. There was no single policy to oppose, no act that demanded defiance. Each change could be justified on its own. Taken together, however, they suggested a pattern. Colonists sensed that Britain was redefining the relationship without saying so openly. British officials believed they were acting responsibly. They saw an empire burdened by debt, exposed to frontier instability, and vulnerable to disorder. Stronger oversight, they believed, would prevent future crises. Neither side believed the other intended harm. That mutual assumption delayed conflict, but it also delayed resolution. As the year ended, colonists did not know what Britain would ask of them next. They did not know whether restrictions would ease or deepen. They did not know how much autonomy would remain once imperial reforms were complete. What they did know was that the relationship they relied on had changed without their consent. That realization lingered. It did not yet inspire resistance. It did not yet inspire unity. It did not yet inspire fear. It inspired watchfulness. Colonists entered 1764 paying closer attention than before. They read policies more carefully. They listened more closely to debates in Parliament. They discussed imperial authority with greater seriousness. 1763 ended quietly. No line was crossed publicly, no turning point was marked. But the year left behind a colonial world that was more alert, more cautious, and less certain than it had been 12 months earlier. The empire had not broken trust, but it had strained it, and that strain would shape how every future decision was understood. End of the year, 1763.